Welcome back to Ancient Philosophy. This is Lecture 5 on the Meno. I'm Dr. Poston at the University of Alabama, and I am enjoying our online course this summer so far. I've really enjoyed reading your papers, seeing your comments, so thank you for that. I hope that you're enjoying our tour through the philosophy of Plato, and then in a couple weeks, the philosophy of Aristotle. So today we're studying the Meno. The Meno is fascinating for its presentation of Plato's theory of recollection and the central thought experiment about learning geometry through Socratic questioning. So when we get to that, we'll have a wonderful conversation. So looking forward to that. So let's go ahead and just jump in to the Meno. So let's move this around a bit. Okay. So the Meno is on the question of whether arete can be taught. Arete here, as you see on the screen, alpha, rho, epsilon, tau, epsilon. We would transliterate this in English as arete, A-R-E-T-E. Arete, the question, can arete be taught, right, is a very common, or was a very common question in ancient Greece. It was raised in the 5th century. There are a number of presentations and discussions of whether arete can taught. So it's very natural for Plato to investigate this question. Arete here is often translated as virtue or excellence. In the book that we're reading, it's translated as virtue, and that can be misleading because we're thinking contemporary readers read this as moral virtue, and there's a sense in which can moral virtue be taught. And, growing up as we have, you might think, well, certainly some moral virtue can be taught. We have moral rules. You can learn what the moral rules are and follow the moral rules. So in some sense or another, right, virtue can be taught. So you might be wondering, okay, this is not a very interesting question. It's important to realize that arete has a much broader range than virtue. It is a trait that applies to non-humans. It applies to horses. Horses have arete. It applies to soil. You can talk about good soil, soil that has this property of arete. States can have this excellence. So the idea here behind arete is it's an aspect or a quality or a set of qualities that makes something an outstanding member of its kind. So when you think about a human being that has arete, your picture is an outstanding person that enables them to flourish as a human being. And as we can see throughout the Meno, arete often, a person who has arete is described as a person who can manage their affairs well. They have friends, get along with people, they have popular influence, they are self-controlled, and so on. So arete here is very different from what we might think of as moral virtue, which we might conceive of as an internal quality. To have arete as a human being is to flourish as a human being. We will see this also when we start our study of Aristotle and talk about Aristotle's conception of the good life. So this is important to keep in mind that arete here has a much broader range. So the Socratic inquiry in the Meno begins in the way that we've seen. So let's see if I can move this around. There we go. All right. So the Meno begins very much like we've seen Socrates doing before. Socrates is questioning Meno about what is the nature of arete. And Meno gives several answers. They're inadequate. He first starts off, as we saw in the Euthyphro, when Socrates is investigating Euthyphro the priest and saying, well, I want you to tell me what piety is. And Euthyphro lists some pious actions. And Socrates says, well, look, isn't piety more general? Aren't there other pious actions than the ones that you have listed? Similar here with Meno, right? Meno is trying to explain what arete is, what the nature of arete is, and he lists a bunch of virtues. Socrates replies, he's like, well, look, you've given me a list of virtues, but you haven't told me what arete is. What is this quality that enables a person to be outstanding? Now, the virtues certainly have something to do with that. Justice, wisdom, moderation certainly have something to do with being outstanding, but they haven't got to the nature of what it is to be Outstanding. So one thing that I want to look at, one example I want to look at, is the example of shape and color. So this is interesting in a lot of respects. So if Socrates were to ask Meno, what is shape? He might reply that, well, shape is a circle, shape is a square, shape is a triangle. But these are A shapes. It doesn't tell us what the nature of shape is. Right? Now, you might think this is a really puzzling question. As you read through the Meno, as Socrates is asking these questions, it's often good to try to give your own answers to these questions. How would you define what shape is? You want a definition that isn't a shape, not a particular shape, right? But in some sense or another explains what shape is. That can be a very difficult thing. So it's important to realize here that this is to get at, in a way, that what Socrates is after, a definition of shape, is a very abstract inquiry. So it's interesting, his answer is that shape is the limit of a solid. So the idea is that we have, right, solids, and what shape is it's the boundary of a solid. Now, that may be adequate, maybe inadequate, but it's an interesting attempt at an abstract account of what shape is. Similarly with color, if we're trying to give an analysis, a Socratic analysis of what color is, we can't just list specific colors. You want to get at something that sort of underline that the specific colors, that all the colors have in common. And I want to look at Socrates' answer here just to give you a sense of how it works, but also a sense of the fact that we are reading dialogues that were written and composed many, many years ago. So over 2,400 years ago. So Socrates explains to Meno what shape is, and then he explains what color is. He says color is the effluvia of shapes that fits the sight and is perceived. And you might be thinking, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. What is effluvia? Now, the thing to think about here is the ancients had a view of perception where they thought that our perception of color tracked real color in the objects. So nowadays, right, we understand a lot more about how light works, how vision works, how surfaces have reflectance properties, and how light waves hit the retina and they are processed in the brain to generate a perception of color. For the ancients, they didn't know any of this. So vision for them was very puzzling. So the thought here is that what color is it's this medium by which shape is sort of put directly into the eye. So I couldn't find on for free images, right, what I love as an ancient view of perception, but this one will work. So if you look at the image we have here, we have Superman, and his infrared or laser vision, and the idea is that the rays are coming out of Superman's eyes. Now, the way ancients are thinking about it is that the rays are coming out of objects and into the eye. It's this effluvia of shapes that directly enter the eye, and that is how color is perceived. Right? So it's not that there's a reflectance property, right? It's that you're sort of, the properties of the objects are sort of being directly beamed up into the eye. So that's interesting. Keep in mind that when we read these ancient theories, they're working out, scientific views on a whole host of issues. And the history of science itself is really fascinating. So if you're interested in this, I'd encourage you to take a course in the history of science. We have an absolutely superb historian of science here at the University of Alabama. So now remember, the goal for Socratic analysis is non-trivial, necessary, and sufficient conditions for a concept. These conditions that in some sense or another explain what the concept is. So let's keep that in mind as we move forward and think about the example of virtue. Okay, so let's move on to the Meno paradox. So I'm going to adjust this a bit. There we go. So the Meno paradox is really where the dramatic action of the Meno takes place. So in the first part of the Meno, we have the typical Socratic questioning, as we've just seen. Socrates is after necessary and sufficient conditions for a counter-virtue. Meno tries to respond. His response is inadequate. And at the middle part of the dialogue, you get this sense of how are we going to proceed, because we no longer know what arete is. And this is where the central paradox occurs. So we have here at 80a, it's Meno talking to Socrates, and he says, how will you search for something, Socrates, if you don't know at all what it is? What sort of thing from among those you don't know will you make the target of your search? Or even if you were to hit upon it with complete success, how will you know that this is the thing that you didn't know at all, when you don't know the thing at all? So this is Meno's puzzlement. How can you search for something when you don't know anything about it? So in the dialogue, right, they just reached this state of ignorance about arete, about virtue. Meno realizes that under Socratic questioning, he doesn't have any idea what arete is. Socrates affirms this. He says, well, Meno, I don't know. I have no idea what arete is. So the question here is, can you acquire knowledge from a state of complete ignorance? And Meno's questions look as if they suggest an argument that radical learning is impossible, that you can't acquire knowledge if you're in a state of complete ignorance. So let's look at an example. This is towelfish example. So I have up here a picture of a fish. I don't know if it's a towelfish. I honestly don't know much about towelfish. I do know there is a fish named a towelfish, but if you asked me to identify the towelfish, couldn't help you. Right? So how could I go about trying to figure out what a towelfish is? Right? Now, we know there's certain sources that you can look at, right? So I know where to find that information, but that is, in a sense, I already have some knowledge, right, about towelfish. If we think about the search this way, I don't know anything about a towelfish. I just suppose that there's a name and that it refers to towelfish. And suppose the method I'm supposed to use is to go catch fish and see if I can identify a towelfish. Well, how would that be possible? Suppose I catch a towelfish. Since I don't know what a towelfish is, I don't know what I have caught, right? So in the state of not knowing what a towelfish is, I can't come to know what a towelfish is just by catching fish, because I won't even know what I have, right, identified, or what I won't be able to identify what I've caught. So this is what you should think about. If you're in a state of complete ignorance about something, right, and there are no experts that you can go and query and say, hey, what's a towelfish? And say, hey, this is a towelfish. And you're like, oh, okay, I've identified what a towelfish is, right? In the sort of circumstance where there are no experts, right, how can you come to know what a towelfish is? So let's continue thinking about this paradox. So here I want to look at two aspects of the paradox that are highlighted by an article by Gail Fine. So I have references at the end of this slide, at the end of this presentation, that you can follow up on if you're interested in exploring more of the Meno's paradox. It's an excellent paradox to continue to think about, to write about. So Fine distinguishes between two aspects of the paradox here. There's the targeting objection, which he says one cannot inquire into something if one does not know at all what it is, since in that case one won't have a target to aim at. Right? So in the towelfish case, right, how can I inquire, right, into what a towelfish is if I don't even know what it is, because I have no way of no way of figuring out what it is, right, that I want to aim at. I don't even know if it's a saltwater fish. I mean, actually I do, but let's, is it a saltwater fish? Let's pretend. Is it a saltwater fish? Is it a freshwater fish? Is it found in Canada? Is it found in Mexico? Is it a Pacific Ocean fish? Is it an Indian Ocean fish? I mean, these are all things we imagine we don't know. And so how could you properly even aim to try to figure out what a towelfish is? And then there's the recognition objection. If one doesn't antecedently know the thing one is inquiring into, one won't be able to know or realize one has found it if one manages to do so. So this is important in the context of trying to figure out what arete is. Like if you list a whole bunch of things and one of them happens, right, to get at the nature of arete, but if you don't know what arete is, you won't know that you found the thing that you're looking for. Think about cases in which you're, learning some mathematics, and you know enough, right, to be able to do some computations, but you don't know enough to figure out whether or not you've got the answer. So you could do some computations and end up with what is, in fact, the answer to your question, but you don't know that that is the answer to your question. So what these two examples suggest, these two aspects of the Meno's paradox suggest, is that radical learning is impossible. And this is what Plato takes the paradox to show. So the conclusion of Meno's paradox is that radical learning is impossible, that you cannot learn something new from a state of complete ignorance. You have to start off with some knowledge. So I want to illustrate this by way of Noam Chomsky's argument for universal grammar. So some of you may have heard about this. It concerns the question, how do people learn a language? How do you acquire your first language? Now, there was a view about language learning that language learning was basically acquired behavior. And a problem with that view is that if you're to look at what small children are able to, how small children learn language, they learn language very rapidly. And they're not exposed to enough evidence, right, say, to learn language in the ways that the behaviorists suggest. So the picture for language learning seems like it requires something internal in order to learn a language. And what Chomsky thought is that people, in a way, do not radically learn a new language. You don't start off in a state in which you have no knowledge of language at all, and then somehow or another you acquire your first language from the tabula rasa, from just the blank slate. Chomsky argues that the data and the situation with behaviorist accounts of language learning suggest that there is an innate structure in the mind that corresponds in some sense or another to a knowledge of language. That there is this innate universal grammar that a person already starts off knowing some things about language. So I think this is a good analogy with the way Plato is thinking here. Is like you cannot start from a state of complete ignorance and come to learn something. You have to already have had some knowledge. So let's look at what Plato says here. So this is in 81d. So since the soul both is immortal and has been born many times and has seen both what is here and what is in Hades, and in fact all things, there is nothing it has not learned. So it is no matter for wonder that it's possible for the soul to recollect both about virtue and other things, given that it knew them previously. For since all nature is akin and the soul has learned everything, there is no reason why someone who has recollected only one thing, which is what people call learning, should not discover everything else, as long as one is brave and does not give up the search. For seeking and learning turn out to be wholly recollection. So we get here Plato's view about how he thinks learning is possible. Learning is possible because an individual person is a body and a soul. And the soul is immortal. It's been around. It's existed prior to birth. And in that state, it knew a number of things already. And what happens when we seem to learn something new, really what's going on is that we are recollecting. We are going through a process of dialectic that will enable us to appreciate, to come to know again ideas that we knew before. So what we're going to see in the geometry lesson that Socrates is going to give us is that we're going to see how this process of recollection is supposed to work. So let's go ahead and turn to this geometry lesson. All right, so I'm going to move this around. Okay, so There is a video on YouTube I'm going to bring up here in a minute. I will link this video to the description. It's about 11 minutes. What I want you to do is pause the video in a minute and watch this geometry lesson. It's a really well done. It's a dramatic reenactment of the central geometry lesson in the Meno with diagrams. Couldn't have done it better myself. I remember when I first, as a very young student, read this description in the Meno, the book we were reading would have pictures of how the geometrical dialogue was supposed to go, and it was really confusing. So you are in a much better position. I think you're going to really enjoy this presentation. So let's go ahead and pull it up and see how this is going to work.
Yes, Socrates, but how do you mean?
So this is the video. Go find it on YouTube and watch it, and we will talk about it in a minute. All right, so I hope you enjoyed that presentation of Socrates' geometry lesson. So we want to think about what is going on with this lesson in terms of Plato's theory of recollection, in terms of some of Socrates' surprising claims that he's not teaching. He's just asking questions. I mean, some of these questions are quite leading questions. So let's turn to that and see what we can make of Socrates' views here. So I will move this over here. All right. So the dialogue here with Meno's servant begins by asking the servant to try to figure out the area of, to figure out the side length of a square that has double the area of the square that they start off with. And what we see is that the servant is unable to come up with the correct answer at first. So we get to the middle part of the dialogue where he realizes that he doesn't have the correct answer. So remember, he thinks that if you double the side length, so you start off with double of the original side length, then you'll get the double area. Doesn't work out. He realizes this. So Socrates is pretty insistent as he's going through this dialogue with the slave that he says, I'm just asking questions. I'm not teaching him. He says, watch, Meno, whether you find me teaching and explaining things to him instead of asking for his opinion. Now, it is interesting that, he's saying here that he's not teaching. It was clearly, this is a case where he is supplying information through a series of leading questions. So how can we make sense of this claim? So I think it's important to contrast this Socratic questioning with a different case of instruction where you might be, you might characterize as just being told. This is especially valuable in the ancient context with the sophists. So the sophists aim for persuasion and conviction. So if you went to a sophist, you wanted to acquire the ability to speak well so that you could convince another person of your point of view. And you didn't care how this convincing happened, right? What you wanted to do is give a person, or rather implant within a person, an internal conviction that a particular idea was correct. There's lots of different ways of doing this. You can use irrational forms of persuasion, you can use advertising, you can use media, and so on. And if you think about just telling people something, so there's results that show that if you just repeat something over and over and over again in different guises and different ways of saying the same thing, that people will come to believe that that thing is true, that they'll be convinced that this thing is accurate. But there wasn't any reasoning process going on. So in that context, I think what we should understand here is that Socrates isn't engaged in anything like that. Socrates is enabling the slave to come to learn for himself how to double the area of any given square. He's not telling him, okay, so you're going to have this formula, and you apply this formula, and you can double it. Right? The geometric progression that he goes through is to enable the slave to say, if I have a square, I can double the area by finding the diagonal and creating a new square out of the diagonal, so that he really understands what is going on. So this illustrates Plato's conception of recollection, is that recollection stirs up these opinions that you have, and it sorts them out so that you come to realize some are inaccurate. So this is the first stage, right, in this conversation. The slave realizes, if we double the side length, that's not going to work. I now know that this is inaccurate. And we see that sort of side discussion between Socrates and Meno, where they say, do you think I've harmed him by him coming to realize that he doesn't know? It's like, no, you sort of helped him along. He now realizes that a view that he had is inaccurate. And then he continues, right, to ask a series of leading questions and providing a very helpful diagonal, right, to realize how to correctly answer the question. But what's going on there is very important, is that Plato and Socrates is holding up a model of what it is to know. You know something when you're able to reason it out on your own, work it out on your own, perhaps with the help of leading, with an expert, but the expert isn't telling you. The expert is guiding you. And that's the crucial difference, I think, that's going on here. So Socrates, Meno, Plato in writing the Meno, says that the man who does not know has within himself true opinions about the things that he does not know. And so this is an interesting aspect of the geometry lesson that Plato and Socrates, Plato seems to think is supported here, that these true opinions are within the slave in this case, and they just need to be brought out by Socratic inquiry. So I'm going to let you make of that what you will. This is a good topic to investigate more. In the end of this lecture, I'll put up some references that you can go and track down. That would also be something that I would be interested more in talking with you about if you have questions about that. Now, note also the conclusion of this geometry lesson is that Socrates says that the slave's knowledge can be as accurate as anyone. Now, I just want to point out that in the Meno, Plato is very optimistic about anyone can acquire knowledge. He has, in a way, this egalitarian view of knowledge, that the truth, as we'll see in a minute, is within you. And it's not within a special class of people, right? Even slaves can come to have, even you might think the lowest class of ancient Greek society can come to have the most accurate knowledge on these matters. And then it's clear from the dialogue that it's not restricted just to geometry. It has to do with considerations about the nature of the individual, the nature of goodness, the nature of excellence, and so on. Right? So there's really a progressive reading here of the Meno, that Plato is sort of pushing this view that knowledge is available and possible for everyone, because they have within themselves this very valuable, knowledgeable soul that needs to be brought out through education. And we see this in the last quote here that I'm going to highlight, is that Socrates says the truth about reality is always in our soul. And what we need to do is to reflect. So there's a passage in the Protagoras, another one of Plato's dialogues here, where he's talking about the need to investigate for oneself before you go to an expert, because you need to sort of grapple at an issue and come to sort of realize what doesn't work and what may work. Because if you go to an expert and ask them, right, to teach you something, you won't be able to distinguish between what is good or bad teaching. So this is an aspect of Plato's view here that I think a lot of people find very valuable. Plato is emphasizing the importance to investigate for oneself, to use your reason. And he has here this view that suggests that everyone who does this can be successful. So let's go on and see what we're going to talk about next. So the dialogue continues after the geometry lesson. And the discussion here is quite interesting, So it is on this question, continuing the question about whether arete is teachable, whether it can be taught. And broadly what we see is we see an argument that arete can be taught, and we see an argument that arete can't be taught. And then we have this final lesson that Plato gives, which is really interesting. We'll talk about it in a minute. So he starts off with this argument that arete is teachable, and the idea is that arete is knowledge, and anything that is knowledge is teachable. So he reasons to the conclusion that arete is teachable because it is a quality that benefits a person. And like other qualities that benefit people, health, strength, beauty, and wealth, right, these benefit people by being used correctly. And they can harm people by being used incorrectly. So they have to be directed by wisdom or knowledge in order to benefit a person. And so you get this argument that arete, since it benefits by being used well. In order to be used well, you have to distinguish between being used well and being used poorly, and so it's wisdom or knowledge. Then he proceeds, right, having just argued that arete is teachable because it's knowledge, that arete is not teachable. And here the conversation is again, interesting. I encourage you to read this. So he says, look, if it's teachable, there should be teachers of arete. And Anticus, who we saw in the Apology as one of the accusers of Socrates, says, well, look, virtuous statesmen don't teach virtue. So they look at several examples of, virtuous statesmen, people who were excellent, exceeding statesmen, and that they were unable to teach virtue to their sons. This is a central puzzle with whether arete is teachable, is that it should be transmitted. It should be capable of being passed on. But when you look at history, it seems that the outstanding individuals, right, of one generation, right, are unrelated to the outstanding individuals of another generation. So it's not a hereditary property. Now, just as a side remark, you may have heard that the equation for success is luck plus effort, right? And the equation for great success is great superb luck and a little more effort. So it's interesting here that the idea that excellence in a way is subject to luck isn't sort of in the ballpark for these ancient discussions. So Anticus says, virtuous statesmen don't teach virtue, and then Meno adds, well, the sophist, right, don't teach virtue, and so you get this skeptical conclusion that arete isn't teachable. And then we get the true belief solution. So let me move this over here. The true belief conclusion. So there are excellent individuals. How is this possible if it's not knowledge? Excellent individuals, recall, are able to guide their affairs successfully. They manage their household. They may manage the state. They are able to gain wealth and gain prestige. They are internally controlled, and so on. Clearly, some people are outstanding. So Socrates suggests that what enables, right, these individuals to be described as having arete is that they, in a way, are inspired. It's almost a gift from the gods, that they are inspired to have true beliefs about what to do. But these true beliefs don't amount to knowledge. So Plato gives this example of knowing your way to Larissa. Larissa is the capital of Thessaly, which we have up there, a map of Greece, and Thessaly is the area in red. Athens is down to the, if you're thinking in a map, it would be down to the southwest, or no, southeast of this map. So if I had a pointer, I could point out where it'd be. It'd be on the western coast towards the south there. So Socrates says, well, look, suppose someone has a true belief about how to get to Larissa. Will they succeed in getting to Larissa? Well, of course, if they have a true belief about how to get to Larissa, they're going to get to Larissa. And what about someone that knows how to get to Larissa? Are they going to be able to get to Larissa? Like, sure, they know how to get to Larissa, they're going to be able to get to get to Larissa. But notice what Socrates says here is that true belief, true opinion is no worse of a guide for correct action than knowledge. So if a person has true beliefs about what will bring about arete, in terms of actually bringing about arete, they're no worse than someone who has knowledge about what arete is and how to achieve it. So Socrates and Meno are puzzled here, and Socrates says, look, I know that knowledge is more valuable than true opinion, but the difference between knowledge and true opinion isn't with respect to action. What is that difference? How do we explain the difference between knowledge and true opinion? And Socrates says that, well, knowledge differs from true opinion in that it's tied down by reasons. And so what I want to do is I want to look at this passage in the Meno. So this is 98a. Here we go. And I am going to move this down. So let's start here. All right. Let me move this over to the side here so that we can all see. In fact, I think I'm just going to get rid of that for now. Okay, so Socrates starts off. What do you mean? If someone had correct opinion all the time, wouldn't he succeed all the time? For as long as his opinions were correct? Meno, that does seem necessary to me. It makes me wonder, Socrates, why on earth? If that's so, knowledge is much more precious than correct opinion. And what makes the two of them different? Why? That is knowledge, Meno is asking, is more valuable than correct opinion. And Socrates says, well, do you know the reason why this is the case, or should I tell you? Meno's like, well, come on, tell me. So Socrates says, let's move up here. Socrates says, it is because you haven't paid attention to the statues of Daedalus. Perhaps they don't even exist in your part of the world. Statues of Daedalus are, kind of think of, as very lifelike. In fact, so lifelike they had a reputation for moving around. So Meno says, what's your point? That the statues of Daedalus run away and escape if they haven't been tied down, but stay with one if they have been tied down. And what of that? What's your point, Socrates? Owning one of his products, one of these statues of Daedalus, isn't of much value if it's untied like a runaway, because it won't stay. But it is worth a lot if it's tied down, for his works are very beautiful. So what is my point? It's about true opinions. For true opinions are a thing of beauty, as long as they stay with oneself, and all their consequences are good. But they're not prepared to stay with one for long. Instead, they run away from the person's soul. As a result, they are not worth very much until someone ties them down by reasoning out the cause. So moving down here. And this, my friend Meno, is recollection, as we've earlier agreed. So the process, he's saying, of reasoning out the cause is brought about by recollection, as we've seen in the example, Socrates' example of learning geometry. When they've been tied down, they become, first of all, instances of knowledge, and secondly, settled. So once you reason out, the cause, you understand how this idea is supported, how you can defend it in Socratic dialogue, then that idea becomes knowledge. It's precisely, he continues, for this reason that knowledge is something more precious than correct opinion, and it's being tied down that makes knowledge different from correct opinion. Okay, so let's bring back the video over here. All right, so we get Plato's view here that the difference between knowledge and true opinion is that knowledge is what is brought out by Socratic dialogue, by this process of recollection where you come to know for yourself the reasons for a claim. So this is, very interesting because Plato is thinking here that it's not enough just to have true opinion. It's not enough just to be told that something is the case. You have to reason it out yourself in order for it to amount to knowledge. So let's move on to the next slide. So here is the conclusion. Whoops. Let's move this down. All right. So the conclusion that Socrates comes to is that arete is modeled on true belief. It's modeled as a gift from the gods. It's this inspiration. And if it's this inspiration, we can understand why it's not hereditary. I mean, the gods give this gift to the father, and then it's not bestowed on the son. Or vice versa, it's not bestowed on the father, but it's bestowed on the son. And we think if it's genuine knowledge, it should be capable of being transmitted. Plato also shows that knowledge requires more than just true belief, even true beliefs under inspiration. It requires an account based on reasons. And this account is brought about through the process of recollection by way of dialectic. When you have this knowledge, your true opinions remain firm. They are related to lots of other things, right, that you have in your mind. So the way you should think about this knowledge is it's knowledge that, in a way, an expert has. Remember the one of the lessons of the geometry case was that the slave can reason out geometry, and his knowledge can become just as accurate as anyone else's. So Socrates is really model here for what it is to know geometry, is that you, in a way, become a mathematician. Now, there's certainly degrees here, right? A undergraduate mathematics student definitely knows some math, but doesn't know it as well as a graduate student, doesn't know it as well as a postdoc student, and doesn't know it as well, right, as, of course, a professor. And these are gradations. The grad student doesn't often know as well as the professor, and so on. But the model there is, in a way, the same. It's different from just being told. It's working it out on your own. Okay, so next up is the Phaedo. The Phaedo, its classic title, was on the immortality of the soul. And what we see here is a painting of Socrates on his deathbed. He's being handed the hemlock, and he's about to drink the hemlock. This is the dramatic setting for the Phaedo. Socrates is reasoning and discoursing about the nature of the soul. So we're going to see some really interesting arguments. It is a very moving piece to read, so I would encourage you to go ahead and read it. Just pick it up and read through it, and just think about what's being said. And the scene at the end is one that is quite moving. So it'll be fun to talk about that on Wednesday. So I want to end just with some references here, just to get you started if you're thinking about working more on the Meno. Now, you should be thinking about final papers. If you are interested in the Meno, check out some of these sources. The Gale Find book you could probably find searching various ways. The article and Alexander Niamas's article are both available, I think, online. If you're interested in some more references, just let me know. I have a list probably of 100 or so odd references to the Meno. So hope you guys enjoy. Look forward to talking to you next time on the Phaedo.